Good afternoon to everybody, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first of all, on behalf of the Government of the Republic of Kazakhstan, warmly welcome you in Nur-Sultan and wish us all fruitful deliberations during this panel session. During this panel session on current systemic challenges confronting the multilateral trading system. For Kazakhstan as host country for the 12th Ministerial Conference of the WTO, this is a very important gathering that contributes to further preparation for the next year's global trade event and provided an excellent opportunity for brainstorming and experience sharing. I am very pleased to welcome here Ambassador of Japan, His Excellency Mr. Junichi Ihara, in Nur-Sultan, and thank for this strong and valuable support of Kazakhstan's offer to host the Ministerial Conference in 2020 in his previous capacity as Chair of General Council of the WTO. Thank you very much. I am also honored to welcome in my country Ambassador of New Zealand, Dr. David Walker, who is currently facilitating the informal process on focused discussions on Appellate body and will chair the WTO General Council during the 12th Ministerial Conference. My sincere gratitude also goes to Mr. Maxim Medvedkov and Ms. Ekaterina Mayorova from Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation, and Mr. Mark Linscott, Senior Fellow of the Atlantic Council, and Mr. Luc Devigne from the European External Action Services for their outstanding role and strong support to Kazakhstan's accession to the WTO. Using this opportunity, I would like to thank you all the WTO members for the anonymous support extended to Kazakhstan's bid to host the 12th Ministerial. Let me also warmly welcome Mr. Victor De Prado, Director of the Council and TEC Division, and thank the WTO Secretariat for the joint organization of this session. The number of distinguished participants from academia speaking in this session is a demonstration of its significance, and I believe their statements will enrich ongoing discussions and bring fresh perspectives and great energy to deliberation within the WTO. Ladies and gentlemen, Kazakhstan is firmly committed to the multilateral trading system governed by the WTO and takes an active part on the work of the organization. The Republic of Kazakhstan stands ready to contribute to addressing all outstanding issues to secure substantive outcomes at MC12. Kazakhstan strongly supports the idea of reforming the WTO. At the same time, we note that reforms should provide a level playing field for all WTO members and include negotiations over old issues that originate from the 2001 Doha Round, including subsidies to agriculture and fisheries. Kazakhstan is also actively contributing with the purpose of launching negotiations on so-called new joint initiatives on electronic commerce, domestic regulation services, trade, and investment facilitation. We believe that the 12th Ministerial Conference would contribute to building confidence in the WTO, maintaining its relevance, and address the current challenges confronting the multilateral trading system. I wish you all very fruitful discussions and enjoyable 2 days in Nur-Sultan. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Zhurnurbekova. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Victor De Prado. I'm the director of the Council and TNC Division in the WTO Secretariat. Ambassador Janar Aichanova has asked me to moderate this panel. I'm very honored to do so. Minister has already introduced some of our speakers, so that makes my task a little bit easier. So I would propose that we go right into the issues. I think all of the speakers have their instructions. We're trying to do this in an orderly way, giving each speaker 6-7 minutes, less if possible because we started a little bit late, and let's see whether we have time for a couple of questions at the end of this session, knowing that there is another session that follows this one, also with very distinguished speakers. What you have here in terms of speakers is an immense accumulated knowledge about world trade, about the WTO, and intelligent people who surely will putting their brains or are being having their brains put to test. The WTO itself is going through a bit of a stress test at this moment in its different functions, in its monitoring, surveillance function, in its negotiating function, in its dispute settlement function. Those of you who have the program in front of you, these challenges are well described in the little summary that is there. So I won't go into much of the description of the problems. What I will say is that I was inspired by the plenary meeting that took place just now, and two things struck me. What Madame Lagarde said, let's walk fast, but composedly hurry up in a slow way. I think we need to hurry up things in the WTO, but we need to think about what we're doing. And the second thing was what the president of Armenia said. We need a vision. So with that, let me invite Ambassador Ihara to take the floor. Junichi-san, you have the floor.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you very much, Madam Minister, for your remarks. I'm very honored to be a part of this distinguished panel, and I'm personally glad to be able to come to New Sultan, Kazakhstan, for the first time. I'd like to start with congratulating Kazakhstan for hosting MC12 in June 2020. One of the most important jobs tasked to the General Council during my term as its chair was to decide the time and venue for the next ministerial conference, MC12. During the consultations, Kazakhstan came forward as a candidate to host the conference, and in July 2018, the decision was taken by consensus at the General Council meeting to hold MC12 in Astana, now named Nur Sultan, in June 2020. Kazakhstan, as you know, joined the WTO only in 2015, which makes it the third newest member to the organization. Kazakhstan's stepping forward to host MC12 sends a very strong signal of its confidence in the WTO and the multilateral trading system. Against the backdrop of a tough environment surrounding international trade, it was encouraging to see a country like Kazakhstan take such an initiative. All WTO members appreciated and acclaimed Kazakhstan's offer. Towards MC12 here in Nur Sultan in about a year's time, a success of the conference depends on many factors, but certainly what we do during 2019 would have significant meaning. By the end of 2019, we aim to conclude the negotiations on fisheries subsidies as tasked by our ministers at the last ministerial conference and as enshrined in Target 14.6 of the Sustainable Development Goals. Despite intensive works going on in Geneva, as of today, we don't see much convergence on how to regulate fisheries subsidies. By the end of 2019, unless we timely succeed in unblocking the member selection process, the appellate body and the entire WTO dispute settlement system will be paralyzed. To avoid such things from happening, we started an informal process under the auspices of General Council. My next speaker, Ambassador David Walker, is serving as facilitator of this process, so I'm sure that he will explain more about this issue. We have also another important deadlines to meet by the end of this year. We need to make decisions on two moratoriums. One is on TRIPS non-violation complaints and another on customs duties on electronic transmissions. No consensus on these moratoriums might have serious consequences, especially on cross-border e-commerce, which increasingly becomes a driving force for international trade. We don't know whether all these issues are successfully fixed this year. If they are not, they will certainly linger onto the MC12 and make Kazakhstan's job as host and chair of the conference more challenging. I now would like to briefly touch upon the WTO reform. We often say, as Victor has said, that the WTO has 3 pillars: implementation of the agreement, dispute settlement, and negotiations. Among these 3 pillars, the WTO has now faced the most significant challenge in its negotiating function. In order to respond to the transformation of international trade due to globalization and digitization, updating the rule book of the WTO is crucial. However, launching a new negotiation at the WTO is currently almost impossible, since we need the consensus of all 164 members. I will take e-commerce as an example. The WTO set up as early as in 1998 a work program on electronic commerce. Our predecessors were already aware of the importance and potential of this new tool of trade in its early days. But unfortunately, since then, the discussions based on this work program have not produced any tangible outcomes. So before MC11, Japan and other like-minded members proposed to revise this work program so that we could start more substantive discussion on e-commerce, which would eventually lead to a negotiation on new rules. But we could not get a consensus in Buenos Aires. Then, on the margin of MC11, 71 WTO members got together and agreed to initiate exploratory work towards future WTO negotiations. And last year, in 2018, this group, we had 9 rounds of meetings, and building on those discussions, in January this year, in Davos, 76 members, which account for 90% of global trade, confirmed the intention to commence WTO negotiations on e-commerce. Benin has recently joined us, bringing the number up to 77. Japan, as a co-convener of this initiative together with Australia and Singapore, we continue seeking a commercially meaningful, high-standard outcome with the participation of as many WTO members as possible. We believe that this initiative on e-commerce would have significant implications, not only in terms of updating rules, but also for the future of the WTO's negotiating function. From Monday to yesterday, we had meetings on e-commerce, and based on very concrete proposals put forward by more than 12 members, we have had a very technical but the constructive discussions. So we hope that in the near future, we will move on to real negotiation phase. To conclude, for the WTO to function as was intended in Marrakesh in 1994, we need to address the reform issues. And for the WTO to remain relevant in today's changing world, a meaningful outcome at MC12 is important. To this end, the efforts of all the members, as well as the leadership of Kazakhstan, will be essential. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Hara, for your perspective as a former General Council Chair, one of the co-conveners of the e-commerce joint statement initiative. Let me ask next Ambassador David Walker, current chair of the dispute settlement body, also a facilitator on the appellate body issues. Your perspective, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And it's also my first time here. Delighted to be here ahead of next year's significant ministerial conference to be held here in June. I have these other hats, but I will spend most of my opening comments wearing my hat as New Zealand's representative in the WTO, just to outline a little bit of the priorities for New Zealand as one of the smaller members in the system. We view the multilateral trading system as fundamental for the sustainable development and prosperity of all its members, from the smallest to the largest. The more up-to-date the rules and the better functioning the system, the greater the benefits for the members will be. Currently, as you just heard, the system is facing significant challenges in its functioning, and the rules need to be updated and modernised. On the rules, the immediate priority for New Zealand is the negotiation on fisheries subsidies. Successful conclusion of that negotiation by December, as mandated, would permit the possibility of ministers here at MC12 being able to welcome the entry into force of the resulting agreement, which would be a significant accomplishment. Under SDGs, people implement them domestically, so no doubt domestic implementation is already well in train, but it's only through the conclusion of an agreement that the WTO members collectively can meet the instructions of ministers and leaders to, and this is the instruction, by 2020 prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, eliminate subsidies that contribute to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing, and refrain from introducing new such subsidies. And that comes from SDG 14.6, as concluded by all our leaders and now underway by the instruction of ministers. Also this year, you just heard Ambassador Hahn reference this, as decided by ministers at our last ministerial meeting, WTO members are required to take decisions on extending the moratoria on customs duties on electronic transactions and TRIPS non-violation situation complaints. New Zealand continues to support both of those moratoria. The other priority this year is a systemic one. Members of the dispute settlement body, for which you heard I'm currently the chair, are currently not meeting their collective responsibility to appoint persons to the appellate body to fill vacancies, quote, as they arise. So in my personal capacity, as you heard, I am currently serving as facilitator of the informal process among WTO members, which is under the auspices of the General Council, on matters related to the functioning of the appellate body. As I reported to the General Council only last week, the task now is to frame possible areas of convergence in finding solutions to the issues that have been raised by members in order to assist the commencement of the process of making new appointments to the appellate body. So we are busy in that process, and I'm required to report again to the General Council meeting in July. Looking beyond this year, there are other areas of WTO rules that also need updating. Primary of these, pardon the pun, is the area of agriculture. Following the historic agreement at MC10 to eliminate agricultural export subsidies, there is a need to continue the process of reform under the agreement on agriculture, with the priority issue for most being reduction in trade-distorting domestic subsidies. With nothing having resulted on agriculture at MC11 in Buenos Aires, many are looking for an outcome at MC12 to bring a bit more evenness to the playing field for international agricultural trade. One key outcome at Buenos Aires was the launch of the so-called joint initiative processes amongst WTO members in areas such as electronic commerce and services domestic regulation. Much work has been done on services domestic regulation, and negotiations proper, as you just heard, are now getting underway on electronic commerce, with the tabling already of quite a significant number of detailed negotiating proposals. It may be that some results in these and other joint initiative areas could be harvested here at Nursultan in June 2020. The multilateral trading system is certainly facing challenges, but with challenge comes opportunity. For New Zealand, defending the rules-based system centred on the WTO is the #1 element in our trade policy strategy as outlined by our Minister for Trade and Export Growth, the Honourable David Parker. Minister Parker will be meeting with ministerial counterparts next week in Paris to discuss progress in the fisheries subsidies negotiation and WTO reform efforts more broadly. Throughout the year ahead to MC12 in Nur Sultan, New Zealand will be seeking to work with like-minded members in efforts to modernise the rules and strengthen the capacity of the multilateral trading system to support trade playing its full part in the sustainable development of all members individually and the sustainable development goals collectively. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. And thank you for keeping the time. Let me ask Monsieur Luc-Pierre de Vigne, Director for Russia, Eastern Partnership, Central Asia, Regional Cooperation, and the OSCE of the European External Action Service. Your title beats mine in terms of length. Monsieur de Vigne, you have the floor.
I hope you meant length and not duration, otherwise I'm worried. But thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, not for the first time in Nur Sultan, but not the first time in Astana. I would like to thank Minister Dalenov for inviting me here, and I'm also pleased that Deputy Minister introduced us, and Minister Ajanova who's now Ambassador of Kazakhstan in WTO, was extremely effective in bringing your country, Kazakhstan, to WTO membership a few years ago, and also effective in negotiating a bilateral agreement with the European Union, the first of one in Central Asia. And I must say that I'm very happy that in the meantime our relations have developed even more, and the European Union being by far the largest trading partner and largest investor in this country. And I say this all the more happily since yesterday, as you may have seen, the European Union has published a new strategy on Central Asia after 20 years. And this updating after 20 years brings me to the topic of today. I think at the risk of being boringly consensual, I will of course agree with the two previous speakers when they said that the WTO system is in actually a very serious crisis, possibly even under a life-threatening danger. And we have a saying in French that criticism is easy, but art is difficult. It was extremely difficult to build this system, and of course it's always easy to find faults, and there are faults, and we do not deny it ourselves, that from the European Union perspective, of course, probably trade and international trade has changed more in 20 years than WTO has changed itself, and therefore there's a gap to fill. But still, it's not a reason to throw away this system, because there is no plan B. There is no alternative WTO. There is nothing similar in terms of effectiveness, and particularly including in dispute settlement in international organization, and I think we should be really cautious here. And clearly we've been extremely worried by the aggravated trade tensions and a shift by certain members or certain member to go to unilateral measures and manage trade more and more. And we believe only concerted efforts can prevent the system to collapse. If I follow the plan of the traditional three functions that we discussed before, on each of these three, I would say, avenues, the EU has proposals. First of all, and I will start by that because it is probably in terms of time the most urgent, and Ambassador Walker didn't speak much in his capacity in chair of the DSB, but rather more as a New Zealand. So I would say that appointments of the Appellate body members, which continue to be blocked, leaving an Appellate body with 3 members, its bare minimum for to function, is frankly leading to collapse of the system by the end of the year. So the clock is ticking. We have the EU, with a broad coalition of both developed and developing countries, submitted a set of proposals in view of unblocking the appointments. We need to pursue this discussion, and we need to seek also US engagement on this, because clearly This is where the problem is. And we have noted that the US have not entered any discussion yet. And at the same time, one cannot complain that WTO rules, existing rules, are not properly enforced, and at the same time blocking the dispute settlement system. We are open in these discussions, but for us, we need to keep three essential features, which is the binding nature of the dispute settlement, the two levels of adjudication, and of course the independence of adjudicators. This cannot be compromised. Secondly, when it comes to negotiations, it is true that we have not been able to properly explore, let alone to deliver concrete negotiated results. And we have failed to update the rule book, which is needed to address today's challenges, such as some which have been mentioned, like forced technology transfer, e-commerce, but also non-market policies or practices, and particularly industrial subsidies for us is a huge problem. So we need to address these issues, we need to create a fairer level playing field, and only that will eventually lead to reducing or eliminating the tensions which are paralyzing the system today. In this regard, we need absolutely China's engagement on stronger disciplines on industrial subsidies, And we need also to move this forward with a reflection about the future agenda around our sustainable development goals. Thirdly and lastly, as was said before, a widely spread non-compliance of existing notification obligations, for instance, of subsidies, and ineffective committee procedures are also hampering a proper monitoring and enforcement of existing rules. We, together with the US, with Japan, with others, we have proposed solutions to aim at improving the compliance notifications of the notification obligations. We have revisited our proposal after constructive remarks received during its first discussion, and we definitely are looking forward to an engagement in this process to arrive at a decision. We also need to improve WTO councils per se and committees' work in addressing trade concerns, and we have also suggested ideas for procedural improvements. To conclude, we are definitely engaged in WTO reform. We definitely want a success there. We don't, as I said, there is no plan B. We don't think there is an alternative. There is no second international trading system. And there are a number of proposals which need to be discussed in depth, and where we need engagement of the two countries that I've mentioned before in different fields. It is also clear that Kazakhstan will have a great responsibility in this regard, and echoing Ambassador Hara wise words, preparation up front is probably the key to the success, maybe not the guarantee for success, but without preparation for sure there won't be success. I'm happy that it's happening in Kazakhstan, because I know how much the role of building bridges in general, but in this case it will be on the international trading system, is important. And President Nazarbayev reminded us this morning of the big ambitions of Kazakhstan in this regard, and we very much support this. So we look forward to a successful MC12 in Kazakhstan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monsieur De Ving, for the European perspective. Mark Linscott, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Mark, this is a new position. You were with the US government before. You have a lot of knowledge of the WTO. What is it required to meet the current challenges in the WTO?
Thank you, Victor. Yes, I wanted to be transparent that even though I'm now a fellow with the Atlantic Council, I spent most of my career at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office at USTR. The last 2 years of which was South and Central Asia, so I was actually spending a lot of time here in Astana, although this is my first time with the city now being Nur Sultan. But most of my career was multilateral. I was in Geneva in the early days of the WTO. That was a fantastic time to be in Geneva. A lot was actually happening. And then years later, between 2012 and 2017, I was the head of WTO and multilateral, where I had the pleasure of being instructed by Janar Ijanova at how to effectively negotiate. I think she won every single battle that we engaged in. So I'm sorry that she's not here today. I worked for a lot of USTRs, going all the way back to Mickey Cantor, Bob Zellick, Susan Schwab, Mike Froman, and for the last 2 years, Bob Lighthizer. And that certainly was enlightening. At this point in time, I think the Trump administration has definitely encouraged some soul searching at the WTO. But that said, well before that, WTO members were already confronting a series of existential questions. At the ministerial conferences in Bali in 2013 and Nairobi in 2015, there were discussions over the fate of the Doha round of trade negotiations and the prospects for new WTO rules to update the multilateral trade playbook and provide new relevance for the organization in a rapidly changing environment. I think it's very hard to argue against new rules in the WTO. The core rules of the system remain sound. This includes the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, and those that were put into place multilaterally after the conclusion of the Ergo Round in 1995, establishment of the WTO at that point in time. However, these rules have not been substantially extended and updated since then, with the notable exception of the Trade Facilitation Agreement concluded in Bali in 2013, and then the lesser exception of rules on agricultural export promotion programs agreed in Nairobi in 2015. There were important plurilateral trade liberalizing agreements on information technology goods, on financial and basic telecommunication services in the first few years of the WTO. After these early successes, the ambitious Doha Round negotiations to build on them essentially failed, and virtually all WTO members have left these efforts behind, while there still is ongoing negotiation on agriculture and important areas like that. So in assessing what might work and what might not, I think it should be reassuring to note that the multilateral trading system has faced crises in the past, and it has proven flexible enough to respond and adapt when driven by forces of creativity. This first happened at the creation of the multilateral trading system with the conclusion of negotiations on the International Trade Organization. The GATT became the default organization when the U.S. Senate failed to ratify the ITO. In the 1970s, at the end of the Tokyo round, GATT contracting parties faced a dilemma when developing countries refused to adopt new rules on non-tariff barriers. A solution was devised. GATT contracting parties agreed to have the results come into force as plurilateral ones, with each country deciding for itself whether to sign up to those rules. Then in 1985, the Ergo Round was launched. It was the most ambitious and the most successful round ever. It covered sensitive areas previously excluded, like agriculture and textiles, new areas of trade like services and intellectual property rights. It, for the most part, multilateralized the plurilateral codes, and it created the WTO as a new institutional structure, a radically different system of dispute settlement with automaticity in terms of adoption of panel reports, no longer a veto right for a losing party, and then, of course, the appellate body. In the early years, the future was looking great. This was when I happened to be in Geneva. That's strictly coincidental. There were new plurilateral agreements, the ITA, basic telecom, financial services. The committee structure was set up and was was very effective. However, WTO members abandoned what was evolving as an incremental approach soon after the creation of the WTO, essentially based on a common perception that negotiation in areas such as agriculture and services could only be successful as part of broad-based and an ambitious round with greater opportunities for trade-offs. In retrospect, at least in my view, this perception, whether born of hubris or habit, may have significantly closed the door to a variety of one-off new agreements in the years that followed. The result was the Doha Round. After more than a decade of negotiations, it proved too ambitious, expectations too colossally mismatched. With the single exception of the trade facilitation agreement, no results, and abandonment of a single undertaking in Bali in 2013. So at this point in time, I think it's important to reflect on a few lessons in history so that WTO members can move forward with a new spirit of creativity and realism. First, it's important to keep the faith. The multilateral trading system is embodied for decades in the GATT and the WTO, has served as a platform for remarkable increases in global trade. In 1947, at the dawn of the multilateral trading system, global trade accounted for less than 5% of global GDP. It's roughly 25% now. And while the WTO is certainly at a crossroads, perhaps its most challenging yet, this moment is not the first time that the system has faced an existential crisis and should not be the only instance in which it fails in confronting and resolving crisis. Secondly, leadership matters. Historically, the United States has probably played the most important leadership role in establishing the system and propelling it forward. If the United States is not willing to maintain that role at this moment, and there are credible questions on that, the challenges ahead will be more difficult to address, particularly in pursuing new approaches to negotiating new rules. But all WTO members bear responsibility in demonstrating leadership, whether that's by breaking out of too long established habits that are in serious need of updating, or bringing new creativity to promoting engagement among such a large group of countries. This does require leadership across a broad cross-section of the membership, large and small, very rich and very poor. Although there may have been too much made of a loss of U.S. leadership, that certainly is happening in e-commerce and fisheries subsidies. It is clear that others are stepping up and more should join the cause. Finally, there's no time to waste. Members need to seize the opportunity now. Looking back over 20 years since the Doha Round was launched, the big successes in the WTO's negotiating forum have been far too rare. Essentially only one success, the trade facilitation agreement, that's been truly multilateral. There have been plurilateral ones, but they were concluded years ago. The appellate body dilemma, and this is where the United States is insisting on much needed reforms, but I would agree, questionable hardball tactics, such as blocking the appointment of judges. This has serious implications for dispute settlement, but at times I feel like it's been dominating much of the attention of members and stakeholders, certainly in terms of grabbing headlines. I do think that this could have changed with the announcement at Davos on a set of plurilateral negotiations on electronic commerce. Hopefully these negotiations can flourish through devising creative ways to bridge gaps and ensuring a high standard agreement at the end of the day. This and potentially other similar efforts, perhaps on fishery subsidies if multilateral negotiations fall short, might echo previous plurilateral successes such as the Tokyo Round codes and the sectoral agreements from the first days of the WTO. It may be that plurilateral options, again, are the best approach for the foreseeable future. So with vision and a greater sense of responsibility among all members, the future of the WTO's negotiating arm could be quite bright. This brings to mind Paul Romer's comments at the plenary. I'm essentially an optimist. I really can see a path forward for the WTO. And frankly, the alternative is really is one to be avoided at all costs. A multilateral trading system that withers and loses relevance or collapses more suddenly in a series of impulsive actions would definitely be disastrous. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. So I noted creativity, flexibility, and leadership. Ms. Ekaterina Mayorova, Director of the Department of Trade Negotiations at the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation. Ms. Mayorova, Russia is not yet 10 years in the WTO. I remember Russia's accession in 2011 very well at the Ministerial in Geneva. What's the Russian perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Victor, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a big honor for me to be here, and I would like to thank my Kazakhstan colleague for the invitation. I think the majority of the audience will feel comfortable if I switch to Russian, so I would probably use my advantage of being a Russian native speaker.
We're trying to join WTO for 18 years. It was a record process during the whole time. So when we finished, we thought that we could use the advantages. We thought that we could get full access to the instruments within the agreements, as part of the agreements, that would allow us to defend our national interests. And second, we thought that we could participate in the development of new rules of international trade that would help us realize our economic potential. But now we can state that the reality, mildly speaking, is far from our expectation. We are of the opinion that we paid for the entrance ticket, but services are offered to us only partially. So instead of stable access to foreign markets, we got a growth of protectionism in a sort of exotic form, like sanctions. Our key partner continues to use limitations in terms of dumping, limitations that were used 25 years ago. So the situation hasn't changed much. I think that the growing negative influence of protectionism is felt by every member of WTO, but effective mechanisms cannot be found by the organization due to long-term disagreements, as it was mentioned before by the previous speakers. We're still going slow on the bilateral rules. Due to very short period of in the organization, the only one breakthrough was the trade agreement, but it was not enough to say that our key economic needs were satisfied. And now, in addition to all the old issues that we have, we got the blockage of operational body, so all the dispute settlement system. The mechanisms of your dispute settlement is difficult now, so by the end of the year we can just lose it without effective mechanisms of control and encouragement of member states to meet the regulations where there is no point. This situation is unacceptable for us. So Russia is part of the camp that thinks that WTO reform is a must. What we expect from it, the main objective is to keep all the current functions in working condition and to keeping the role of WTO as the global regulator of the world trade. Reforms should be oriented towards the problems and systemic and operational problems that are hampering the effectiveness of bilateral negotiations to effectively do the current activities, given the monitoring of trade regimes, and effectively settle trade disputes. In our opinion, first of all, the first major task is to recover the work of Appellate body. And we think that the keeping it as a hostage for the progress in other directions will not likely to result in good outcome. So there is no incentive to talk about some new rules if we don't have the instrument to do the current rules. We keep the ideas, we support the ideas that many of our colleagues in Geneva have suggested regarding the mechanisms of improving the rules in terms of notifications and transparency and regulations of the organization. And we notice that the value of some bodies of WTO, if not zero, but is close to zero. So some inventory of their activities should be made. We also think that WTO cannot be relevant without the adjustment of the rules to current reality. So in that regard, for us, we think it's important to get the strength of the organization against the protectionism and its hidden forms. Without that, it's difficult to talk about the prediction of trade regimes.
So we've been very closely following those negotiation and concepts, negotiation proposals and concepts connected to the modification of the WTO rules. And we understand that countries have different interests, and we need to work over those proposals. So we've been closely following, of course, as what is happening about what Luke was saying about making stricter rules of industrial subsidies regulation. But we think this is more one-lateral approach if we focus only on improving the subsidy rules, improving in the industry. For us, the key issue here, the key element here is also the revising the rules of agricultural subsidizing in order to make the to improve the balance. So all the key concerns in the reform context are well known, and taken into account the difficulty of the topics that are now being discussed and being negotiated, I think we need to act quickly and have a concerted action. It's clear that we'll have to do compromises, and this is absolutely inevitable. And we should not get into too long negotiations, which is, as an example of Doha round, can take decades without any success. And for this, as I see, we need a group of people who think alike, members of WTO, who are able to be leaders in promoting the reform and are ready for quick consensus on major elements of the reform. We need a driving force that will be moving the process forward and overcoming the pressure of long-term disagreements. Only in this way we'll be able to achieve some tangible results by the 12th Ministerial Conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina. Next, Professor Michael Hahn, Director of the Institute for European and International Economic Law, the University of Bern. Professor Hahn, the academics have a solution for us, don't they?
Good news, Victor. Absolutely, absolutely. Now, before I make my little presentation, and I will be very short, and I have very little useful to add to the very rich contributions before that, let me first thank the host, the government of the Republic of Kazakhstan, represented here by the Vice Minister for Trade, but also by the Geneva team, Damigul Kabiyeva, and many others who have contributed to this. Many thanks for having me. The ambassador had asked me to look a little bit at what, so to speak, academia can bring to that discussion. And before I do that, I just want to take a quick step back to look at why we are in the situation we are, being so ably described by my predecessors, then make 3 short points, and then say something which will not surprise you how important academia is, despite what you think. Clearly, the last 25 years have seen a lot of change. 1994, and some of us were around then already, others weren't, was really a very different time from now. The US, for different reasons, was the only true superpower. There was a genuine belief that things would develop in a harmonious fashion. The internet, I recall at the time I was visiting professor in the US. I had one good friend in Geneva, so we exchanged emails from time to time, and these were 1 or 2 emails per day one got. And of course today everything is very different. The world has changed dramatically. The US is not only the only superpower. Yes, they remain strong in many ways, and we see the consequences of the 2016 elections. But we have with Russia, China, Brazil, many others, very, very important regional and global powers who are quite assertive in what they do. The US is giving up a little bit the role as godmother of the system, and this, of course, has changed the parameters in which you operate. 3 little points. I do think that one of the reasons for the crisis we have is the single undertaking approach. When it happened, we were all so happy about it. The practitioners were happy about it. The academics were happy about it. We said, this is wonderful because it basically forces you to take everything. You cannot get your dessert if you take only your veggies. You have to take both the veggies and the dessert. This is healthy for you, and therefore it's a good thing. We have seen, I believe, at least I think it's worthwhile discussing that we need something like a variable geometry approach more than ever. And when I flew in, I read for the first time the 2-day-old proposal by China on WTO reform, and I was really surprised to see and very pleased to see under point 111 that China makes the following statement: opportunities and challenges have been brought about by the new wave of science and technology. I stop here. We are prepared to use a flexible open, transparent, inclusive, and flexible approach to explore a new set of rules. I read that as an opening for actually discussing that, and I think that's a most welcome statement in the middle of a trade war with the US. Second point I wanted to make, I think many of the speakers have talked about the crisis of the appellate body. I think this is a really urgent thing. I think, however, it's also important to realize that the appellate body is not the only element of the dispute settlement mechanism. I think there should also be an effort to consider what happens if the WTO appellate body is inoperational. I think that will happen at the end of the year. I don't think it is realistic to expect otherwise, but that doesn't mean that we cannot have a suboptimal, clearly suboptimal, but nevertheless a working dispute settlement mechanism, and I think some effort should flow into that. The third point, and very high altitude point, I think it would be worthwhile to look a little bit into the future, to quote Victor with a vision. I normally am skeptical of the word vision, but it's very popular these days. Insofar, I'm a fan of Bush Père, but nevertheless, I will use it here. We need to go beyond goods and services. When hedge fund money is now flowing into information without actually knowing why, but there is the assumption that artificial intelligence will make this a valuable business proposition at some point. So I understand that more money is going into acquiring information than actually into artificial intelligence at that point. If that is the case, we should, and we meaning member states, but also of course academia, should actually look at these things and be prepared to go about this over or go beyond the dichotomy goods and services. I have one more minute. With that, I would come to trying to answer the question of the ambassador, what academia can contribute, and I would that dovetails actually with what the president of Armenia said in the plenary. Number one, I think, and maybe that's the most important part of what academia can do, despite the fact that often it's not the most popular ones, especially for the senior people, namely that's teaching. It's teaching our young colleagues who come up. We and many other fine institutions try to do that, both at the master's and the postgraduate level. I think that makes a whole difference to have that kind of sound legal training embedded in a general education on international law, international relations, economics, and law. Secondly, I think, and there I think many things could be improved. I think it's really important that member states, governments, i.e. the civil service, and academia are more in exchange. In some countries that is the case, typically in smaller countries. New Zealand would be one example. The country I live and work in would be an example. But in other countries that's less the case. And I think both sides are losing because of that. Academia tends to then often be, too theoretical and lose its relevance. And I think at the same time, government does profit from ideas. They might be too blue sky, but I think they can be useful, especially as we are looking at so many disruptive developments in the next 20 to 50 years, for which I think every valuable idea is worth taking on board. With that, Mr. Chair, dear Victor, back to you.
Thank you very much, Michael. No, thank you. Thought-provoking statements there. The appellate body is not the only element. Serious outside-the-box thinking needed, I guess. My predecessor as director of the council used to say that only saints have visions. I do not necessarily agree. I think leaders also have visions, and I think leadership is necessary there. Niall Meagher, Executive Director of the Advisory Center for WTO Law. Niall, you deal a lot with developing countries. Is there a role for the developing countries in all of this discussion? Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Good afternoon, everybody. I would also like to begin by thanking the Minister and the Government of Kazakhstan for the invitation to participate here, and all of the logistical assistance from the mission and colleagues here in Nur-Sultan. My first time in both Astana and Nur-Sultan. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about the problems we're facing, and I look forward to coming back in a little over a year from now for the ministerial conference, hopefully to talk about the solutions that have been reached. You know, one of the things that struck me from the plenary session this morning was how often the speakers referred to the importance of the rules-based system. And, we had, I don't think, any lawyers on the panel for the plenary session. It's normally lawyers that talk about rules, so it's interesting when the business and economists and the political people all talk about rules. And this is because a rules-based system is important to give what I think businessmen crave perhaps the most, which is certainty in their business environment and predictability. you're not going to export goods from Kazakhstan, or a Kazakh company is not going to open an office in another country unless they've got some sort of security and predictability as to the environment in which they're trading and the enforceability of the rules under which they think they're trading. And I think that's particularly important to developing countries because there are some WTO members that can perhaps regulate their affairs through the exercise of power by flexing their muscles, but most can't. And I think that's reflected a little bit in the work of my organization. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Advisory Center, the ACWL, it's an intergovernmental organization that was set up in 2001 to enable developing countries such as Kazakhstan, which is not yet a member but hopefully will be in the near future, to obtain the sort of legal advice to enable them to benefit from the rules-based system that, for example, the US has in Washington through the extremely competent USTR people, or the European Commission has in Brussels. So we serve effectively as the sort of in-house lawyers for developing countries that join our organization and use our services. And we currently have 35 developing countries. And they are, and all the LDCs are entitled to our services also. So we have a total of 79 WTO members, almost half the WTO membership that are entitled to our services. And they use those services because these countries see the importance of a rules-based multilateral trading system that's enforceable through a viable system of dispute settlement as very important to them achieving their trade and development goals. And that's seen in the extent to which they use the dispute settlement system. We have currently in our office 18 dispute settlement proceedings. Since we're set up, we've been involved in 20% of all the WTO disputes. And that's not the US, China, even Brazil, the EU, the bigger countries. That's countries like Guatemala, Peru, Turkey, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam, that are using the system. And for those countries, it's extremely important that we have a functioning rules-based system, and that means a functioning dispute settlement system. So many of the proposals that are on Ambassador Walker's desk about how to reform the system come from these countries because they're aware of the importance of the dispute settlement system. Because if the dispute settlement system withers, the rules eventually wither. And it's interesting how much this is reflected in day-to-day life in Geneva. For the time being, countries are still bringing new disputes in the panel stage, knowing that when it gets to the appellate body, it may be blocked. Because for these countries, it's the only way. They can't enforce the rules through flexing their muscles. These are increasingly disputes between developers.
Это подчеркивает важность или повышающуюся важность торговли, саб-торговли. И, опять же, правила становятся очень важными. Я думаю, есть серьезная перспектива для развивающихся стран. Почта, звонки, чтобы убедиться, что система разрешения споров продолжала функционировать и стала таким зонтиком, под которым все члены ВТО смогли получить консультации, решить проблемы, которые разрешаются на ежемесячной основе и еженедельной основе. Это все приведет к это все будет уменьшаться, все эти проблемы, если страны не будут чувствовать, что правила нарушаются, и будет очень сложно, особенно в развивающихся странах, для торговых министерств для других министерств, чтобы объяснить другим министерствам, почему нам нужно следовать этим правилам сейчас. Теперь, если кто-то спросит министра торговли, почему нам нужно следовать правилам, самый простой ответ, потому что они обязательные. Второй ответ более сложный. Эти правила имеют для нас преимущество, имеют интересы для нас, но простой ответ — это они важны, они обязательны. Это будет намного сложнее для торговых министерств объяснить другим министерствам, что нам нужно следовать этим правилам, потому что будет вопрос о том, что нету разрешения споров, потому что большие страны, например, не следуют правилам, почему тогда мы должны следовать, поэтому это все надо избежать. Это ситуация, в которой развивающиеся страны могут участвовать, они могут продвигать эту проблему принятия определенной, как сказал представитель Уокер, чтобы разблокировать этот кризис в смысле апелляционного органа. Я бы сказал, что у нас нету времени в детали углубляться по апелляционному органу, но нужен определенный процесс возрождения апелляционного органа, и с учетом этого за последние 25 лет мы привыкли к системе, где принимаются решения панели, где панелисты принимают решения, где все подвергается профессиональному взгляду. И я думаю, это увеличивает шансы на хорошую систему разрешения споров. Это делает легче, чтобы мы могли использовать какие-то определенные страны. Мы потеряли, например, панелиста, мы потеряли панель. Сейчас нам нужно менять что-то. У нас сейчас еще нету этого уровня обзора, поэтому система теряет доверие, теряется.
The objections that have been raised about the appellate body, some of them are very procedural. Whether the appellate body must complete a report in 90 days, which is a very tough deadline, and what to do if it can't. Some of those issues ought to be, if there's a willingness, they're very easy to resolve. Some of the other issues are slightly more conceptual. You know, when is the appellate body going too far? When is it not going too far? My experience there is that these are slightly philosophical issues that I think in the GATT days would have been delegated to a technical group of experts to resolve. And they're quite hard for members to resolve because, very simply, when a WTO member wins a dispute, it thinks the appellate body has done a fantastic job. When it loses a dispute, it thinks that the appellate body has done a terrible job and we need to get rid of the appellate body. And I think we need to get out of that mentality to reach a solution to some of these issues. With that, I'll just say thank you very much again for the invitation, and I'll hand back to Victor.
Thank you very much indeed, Niall. And unless there are any burning questions from the audience or from one panelist to the other, and let me pause here to see. If not, I would like, oh, there is one question there. Yes.
Hello, my name is Arayka Subekova. I was just recently part of Kazakhstan's delegation in Geneva, now independent consultant. So I have a question to the panelists, anyone who'd like to take up the question, that some of the commentators might think that WTO is in crisis, they can start triumphing about it, and they can point at recent movement to regionalism, taken as an example of CPTPP. So in your own assessment, I'd like to hear your own personal assessment. What do you think the WTO would the WTO members would do what they are contemplating or possible scenarios if the crisis is not overcome by December this year. Another question is, as Katerina mentioned and Michael, that other countries that are willing to take up this leadership role, do you have some in your mind or observations about the countries are willing to take leadership role in the future WTO negotiations to find the solutions to the crisis? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So one question about regionalism and the crisis, and another question about leadership. Any volunteers? Yeah, Ambassador Hara.
I want to share my view about the regional trade liberalization efforts and the multilateral efforts. Japan is promoting TPP, and now I'm involved in e-commerce discussions in Geneva. I noticed that the many proposals put forward by members are based on members' experiences in regional and other bilateral FTAs. So today, many knowledges and experiences come from those bilateral regional liberalization efforts. So what WTO should do is to absorb those accumulated experiences and the knowledge so that we can enrich WTO itself, or we can enlarge the WTO's role to cover new areas. So there is complementary relations between regional and the bilateral efforts and multilateral efforts. Or we should make them complementary.
Thank you. David? Mr. Walker?
Yes, I definitely echo that. And that's very much the way we look to do it in all of the regional and plurilateral processes that we're involved in as well, including with Japan. On the leadership point, you actually see that going on quite a bit at the moment in the WTO, with a number of different members getting together to come up with ideas and drive proposals. Ambassador Hara, together with Singapore and Australia, have been driving the joint initiative process on electronic commerce. There are a bunch of members who have come forward with proposals to assist the notifications process, others on specific areas of operation of the WTO committee. And then little groups of members get together to try and talk more in the general about, we've got a problem, what can we do about it? In the lexicon of crisis and opportunities, I heard someone say the other day that out of every crisis comes an opportunity, and someone said, well, we have then a very big opportunity indeed at the moment.
Thank you, Ambassador Walker. Monsieur Devine.
Thank you for these two questions. Just briefly, of course, there is no legal contradiction between regional agreements and WTO per se. This is why you have the MFN exemptions for free trade agreements. But of course, there is a policy, and it is clear, for instance, for the EU. I remember that when Pascal Lamy, before being the Director General of WTO, when he was our trade commissioner, we didn't do bilateral agreements, we didn't do FTAs, because we wanted to give priority to multilateral system, which we had founded, because the idea is, of course, that it's more efficient to make a deal for the whole world than to make variant deals, and then you have issues of compatibility sometimes. But unfortunately, you know the history, and you know the history of a number of ministerials who failed, and therefore we also went into a number of FTAs or ongoing negotiations around the world. But still, we still give a premium WTO membership. We do not do free trade agreements with non-WTO members, for instance. We still demand that. And that way we support the system. As to the leadership, we also have on papers that we've tabled, be it on the appellate body or be it on improving notification, compliance within committees, etc. I mean, I'm not going to go into a contest on who's leading whom, but just politically, for us, WTO remains a very precious core value that we want to defend. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark.
Thank you. First on the regional question, you know, I was around in Geneva. This was late 90s, and everyone was freaking out that new regional FTAs were being launched. And it was essentially following a model that the EC had set up. You know, in the end, the organization survived, and I couldn't agree more with the ambassadors of Japan and New Zealand about them being complementary. In fact, in TPP, there was a deliberate effort to negotiate something on fisheries subsidies so that it could be brought into the WTO, plurilaterally or multilaterally, but it would be the platform for doing something in the WTO, and I do think that that can be done. In terms of leadership, you know, I don't know that we would have a trade facilitation agreement if there had not been a core group of countries called the Colorado Group, developed and developing. It was very organic, which really pushed things along over the course of many years, and ultimately it did emerge as, frankly, I think a huge new multilateral agreement. But it really started with that leadership among a large number of countries in the Colorado Group.
Thank you very much. And with that, since we're running out of time, let me ask you all to give a big round of applause to our speakers. And let me join other speakers in thanking the organizers, thanking the government of Kazakhstan. Also, we're going to take a short pause now for changing the nameplates here, but don't go away. We have an amazing second panel of speakers on this issue you will not regret. Thank you very much.